The morning sun cast long shadows across forward operating base Phoenix as Cassie Evans traced her finger along a worn topographical map, calculating distances that could mean the difference between life and death. At 23, the soft-spoken communications specialist from Wales had spent 8 months being dismissed as too academic for real field operations. Her colleagues saw her constant map study as obsessive, her route memorization as unnecessary, her accent as out of place among hardened Marines. But in less than 6 hours, 30 Marines would find themselves trapped in a deadly ambush with no way out, and the same navigation skills everyone had mocked would become their only hope for survival. What happened next would forever change how an entire unit viewed the quiet young woman they'd underestimated. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. Cassie Evans had always been different, and in the rigid hierarchy of forward operating base Phoenix, different was rarely welcomed. At 23, she stood just 5'4" with auburn hair typically pulled back in regulation style and green eyes that seemed to take in every detail around her. Her Welsh accent, softened by years of military service, still drew sideways glances from her American colleagues who couldn't quite place her among the usual archetypes of military personnel. As the unit's communications specialist, Cassie was responsible for maintaining radio equipment, coordinating signal protocols, and ensuring clear channels between field units and command. It was important work, but it kept her in the background while others took center stage in combat operations. What her colleagues didn't know was that Cassie had grown up in the Brecon Beacons, where her father, a former SAS operator, had taught her to read terrain like others read books. Every evening after her official duties ended, Cassie would spread topographical maps across her small desk in the communications tent. She studied elevation changes, memorized grid coordinates, and calculated walking times between significant landmarks. Her tentmate, Corporal Sarah Mitchell from Texas, often teased her about this obsession. "Evans, you know GPS exists, right?" Mitchell would say, watching Cassie mark another route on her personal maps. "All that old-school navigation stuff is basically useless now. We've got satellites for a reason." Cassie would smile politely, but continue her work. She'd learned not to explain that GPS signals could be jammed, that satellites could fail, that sometimes the difference between survival and catastrophe came down to knowing the land so intimately that you could navigate by instinct alone. Her father had drilled this into her during childhood hikes through Welsh mountains, but explaining her unconventional upbringing to career Marines seemed futile. The dismissal wasn't limited to her tentmate. During mission briefings, when Cassie occasionally offered route suggestions based on terrain analysis, she was met with polite nods and immediate dismissal. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the unit's operations leader, had a particular talent for making her feel invisible. "Thanks for the input, Evans," he'd say with barely concealed condescension, "but we've got experienced pathfinders for route planning. Focus on keeping our comms clear." The pattern repeated itself weekly. Cassie would identify potential risks in planned routes, areas where units could become channeled into kill zones, alternate paths that offered better tactical advantages, or terrain features that could provide cover during withdrawals. Her suggestions were consistently ignored, filed away as the overeager contributions of someone trying to exceed her assigned role. Captain Marcus Webb, the unit commander, seemed to view Cassie's navigation interests with bemused tolerance. During a particularly frustrating briefing 3 weeks ago, he'd addressed her concerns directly. "Evans, I appreciate your enthusiasm for cartography," he said, his tone suggesting he found her passion quaint but misplaced. "But we have Marines with years of field experience making these decisions. Your job is vital, but it's communications, not pathfinding." What her colleagues didn't understand was that Cassie's enthusiasm was actually expertise developed through years of intensive training that went far beyond standard military navigation courses. Her father hadn't just taught her to read maps, he taught her to understand how terrain influenced human behavior, how geography could be leveraged for tactical advantage, and how intimate knowledge of an area could turn disadvantage into opportunity. In her personal time, Cassie had mapped every square kilometer within a 50-kilometer radius of base Phoenix. She knew which wadis offered concealment, which ridgelines provided observation points, and which seemingly solid ground would collapse under the weight of heavy equipment. She'd memorized the locations of every village, every water source, every potential helicopter landing zone.
This knowledge remained private, shared with no one, because Cassie had learned that her colleagues interpreted preparation as presumption. They saw her detailed maps and route cards as evidence that she was trying to do someone else's job, rather than recognizing them as the tools of someone who understood that preparation could save lives. The isolation deepened when rumors began circulating about her background. Someone had discovered that her father was former SAS, and instead of respecting this connection, it became another source of dismissal. "No wonder she thinks she knows better than everyone," she'd overheard Private Johnson saying to his squad mates. "Probably grew up hearing stories and thinks that makes her qualified for real operations." The irony was painful. Cassie's extensive knowledge came not from stories, but from practical training that had begun when she was 8 years old. Her father had taught her navigation as a survival skill, not as entertainment, but explaining this would have sounded like boasting, so she remained silent. As spring turned to summer, Cassie found herself increasingly marginalized during operational planning. Her role became purely technical, maintaining radio equipment, testing signal strength, and updating communications protocols. She was essential to every mission, but excluded from every decision that mattered. The morning of June 15th began like any other, with Cassie performing her routine equipment checks while the rest of the unit prepared for a patrol into Sector 7. She listened to the briefing from her position at the communication station, noting the planned route and identifying immediately the tactical vulnerabilities that no one else seemed to recognize. The patrol route would take 30 Marines through a valley system that offered excellent concealment for hostile forces, while providing limited escape routes for the patrol itself. Cassie had studied this area extensively and knew that the planned path would channel the unit into a natural killing ground where enemies positioned on the surrounding heights could pin them down with devastating effectiveness. She considered approaching Captain Webb with her concerns, but stopped herself. 3 previous attempts to share similar insights had been met with dismissal, and she'd learned that persistence was interpreted as insubordination rather than dedication. Instead, Cassie quietly updated her personal maps, noting the patrol's planned route and calculating alternative paths that could be used if the primary route became compromised. It was a habit she'd developed, always having contingency plans ready, even if no one asked for them. As the patrol departed Base Phoenix, Cassie settled into her routine communications routine, monitoring radio traffic and maintaining contact with the field unit. The morning was bright and clear, perfect weather for operations, and nothing suggested that this routine patrol would become the defining moment of her military career. But Cassie Evans had long ago learned that preparation wasn't about predicting when something would go wrong. It was about being ready when it inevitably did.
The dismissal of Cassie's expertise wasn't just casual oversight. It was systematic and deeply embedded in the unit's culture. 3 months earlier, during a routine mission planning session, she had witnessed the full extent of how her knowledge was disregarded in favor of conventional wisdom that would prove dangerously flawed. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had been briefing the patrol leaders on a reconnaissance mission into the northern valleys when Cassie noticed a critical error in their planned approach. The route would take the team directly through what locals called Devil's Throat, a narrow canyon that offered no escape routes and perfect positioning for ambush. She'd spent weeks studying this particular area and knew that recent rainfall had made the alternative mountain paths passable again. "Excuse me, Staff Sergeant," Cassie had interrupted, her Welsh accent drawing immediate attention in the crowded briefing room. "I've been monitoring weather patterns and local intelligence reports. The northern route through Sector 4 might be compromised. There's an alternative approach that would be much safer." Rodriguez paused, his expression shifting from professional focus to barely concealed irritation. Around the room, other Marines exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their perception of her interruption. Captain Webb leaned back in his chair, preparing to watch what he clearly expected to be an educational moment about staying in one's lane. "Evans," Rodriguez said, his tone carrying the weight of institutional authority, "we appreciate your enthusiasm for operational planning, but route selection is handled by experienced pathfinders who understand ground truth in ways that communication specialists simply don't." The words stung not because they were harsh, but because they were so fundamentally wrong. Cassie understood ground truth better than anyone in the room, but her expertise was dismissed based purely on her assigned role rather than her actual capabilities. Private Thompson, one of the patrol leaders scheduled for the mission, reinforced the dismissal with a comment that revealed the deeper cultural issues at play. "No offense, Evans, but reading maps in a tent isn't the same as humping gear through hostile territory. Some of us have been doing this for years." What Thompson didn't know was that Cassie had been humping gear through hostile territory since she was 12 years old, training in conditions that made their local operations seem manageable by comparison. Her father's training regimen included multi-day navigation exercises through Welsh mountains in winter conditions that would have challenged most active-duty soldiers. But explaining this background would have sounded like boasting, and Cassie had learned that any attempt to assert her qualifications was interpreted as arrogance rather than professional competence. She remained silent while the briefing continued with route selections that she knew were tactically unsound. The mission proceeded as planned, and the reconnaissance team walked directly into the ambush that Cassie had predicted. 3 Marines were wounded in the resulting firefight, and the team had to be extracted under fire after being pinned down for 4 hours. The after-action report blamed unexpected enemy activity, rather than acknowledging the predictable consequences of poor route selection. When Cassie later learned about the casualties, she felt a combination of vindication and frustration that was becoming increasingly familiar. Her analysis had been correct, but being right about disasters that could have been prevented offered no satisfaction. She'd tried to help and been dismissed, and now people had paid the price for that dismissal. The pattern repeated itself regularly. During equipment inspections, Cassie would notice gear configurations that were inappropriate for local conditions. Her suggestions for modifications were met with explanations about how things are done that ignored the specific requirements of their operational environment. When communication protocols needed updating to account for terrain-specific signal propagation issues, her technical recommendations were simplified into inadequate compromises that satisfied doctrine but ignored practical requirements. Most frustrating was the way her colleagues interpreted her expertise as an overreach rather than an asset. Corporal Mitchell had made this explicit during a conversation that Cassie wished she could forget. "Look, Evans, you're good at your job, but you gotta understand that everybody here has a role. When you start trying to do everyone else's job, it makes people think you don't respect their expertise." The irony was almost unbearable. Cassie's problem wasn't disrespecting others' expertise, it was that her expertise exceeded her assigned role in ways that made others uncomfortable. She wasn't trying to do everyone else's job, she was trying to contribute capabilities that could help everyone do their jobs better. But the military culture around her couldn't accommodate someone whose abilities didn't fit neatly into established categories. Rodriguez made this explicit during her quarterly performance review when he addressed what he called her scope creep issues. "Evans, your technical performance is outstanding. Your equipment maintenance is flawless, your communication protocols are efficient, and your technical knowledge is comprehensive. But there have been concerns about your tendency to involve yourself in areas outside your assigned responsibilities." When Cassie asked for specific examples, Rodriguez cited her route suggestions, her equipment recommendations, and her inappropriate focus on tactical considerations that fell outside her role. The evaluation praised her competence while essentially criticizing her for being too competent in areas where competence wasn't expected. Captain Webb had been more direct during a private conversation that followed the formal review. "Evans, I need to know that my specialists are focused on their assigned missions. The military works because everyone understands their role and stays in their lane. When someone starts acting like they know better than experienced operators, it creates problems." The assumption that her knowledge represented arrogance rather than preparation revealed how deeply the dismissal was embedded in the unit's thinking. No one considered that her expertise might be genuine, that her suggestions might be valuable, or that her preparation might reflect dedication rather than presumption. This systematic dismissal created an environment where Cassie's most valuable capabilities were not just unused, but actively discouraged. She learned to keep her observations to herself, to limit her suggestions to technical matters directly related to communications, and to accept that her broader military knowledge would remain unrecognized. The isolation deepened when other Marines began treating her expertise as a kind of character flaw. She overheard conversations that painted her attention to detail as obsessive, her preparation as inappropriate, and her knowledge as presumptuous. The very qualities that made her exceptional were redefined as problems that needed to be managed rather than assets that could be leveraged. By June, Cassie had largely stopped offering suggestions during briefings. She learned that her input was unwelcome and that persistence would be interpreted as insubordination rather than dedication. Instead, she focused on performing her assigned duties flawlessly while privately maintaining the preparation that she hoped would never be needed. But on the morning of June 15th, as she monitored the radio traffic from the patrol moving through Sector 7, Cassie realized that her preparation might soon become the difference between life and death for 30 Marines who had spent months dismissing her expertise as irrelevant enthusiasm. The irony was that their survival might depend on the same knowledge they'd refused to acknowledge.
At 13:47 hours, the routine patrol reports from Sector 7 suddenly stopped. Cassie Evans sat in the communications center, her headset crackling with static as she repeatedly attempted to raise Alpha Squad on their designated frequency. What should have been a standard position report had become an ominous silence that sent ice through her veins. Alpha 1, this is Base Phoenix, requesting status report, she transmitted, adjusting frequency settings to compensate for potential terrain interference. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of automatic weapons fire echoing through the radio's ambient pickup. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez burst into the communications center, his face grim with the kind of focused intensity that marked genuine crisis situations. Evans, what's the last known position on Alpha Squad? Cassie consulted her log, though she'd already memorized every detail of the patrol's planned route. Grid reference 347829, approximately 2 kilometers into the valley system. They were proceeding toward Objective Bravo when communications went dark. How long since last contact? 17 minutes, Cassie replied, her training keeping her voice steady despite the growing dread in her stomach. She knew that terrain better than anyone in the base, and 17 minutes of silence from that position meant only one thing. The patrol had walked into exactly the kind of ambush she'd been predicting for months. Captain Webb arrived as Cassie was attempting to reach the patrol through emergency frequencies. His expression carried the weight of command decisions that could determine whether 30 Marines came home alive. What do we know? Rodriguez briefed him quickly while Cassie continued her attempts to establish contact. The patrol's last known position placed them in the narrow section of the valley where the surrounding ridge lines offered perfect observation and fields of fire for hostile forces. It was a textbook killing zone, the kind of terrain that military doctrine specifically warned against entering without extensive reconnaissance and overwatch support. "Sir," Cassie interrupted, unable to remain silent while lives hung in the balance, "that position puts them in the most vulnerable section of the entire valley system. If they're under fire, they have extremely limited options for movement or extraction." "What do we know?" Webb asked her, with the kind of attention that crisis situations demanded. "Explain." Cassie moved to the wall-mounted map, pointing to the patrol's last known location. "They're here in what's essentially a natural funnel. The ridgelines on both sides provide commanding observation posts and the valley floor offers minimal cover. If hostile forces have positioned themselves on the high ground, Alpha Squad would be completely exposed." "What are their options for withdrawal?" Webb asked, and Cassie felt a moment of hope that her expertise might finally be taken seriously. "The planned route back would take them through the same killing zone," she explained, tracing the patrol's intended path. "They'd be moving uphill against prepared positions, which would be tactically disastrous. But there are alternatives." Rodriguez stepped closer to the map, his skepticism evident. What kind of alternatives? Cassie had studied this exact scenario dozens of times, but she'd never been given the opportunity to brief anyone on her analysis. There's a secondary ridge system to the east that offers concealed movement routes. It's difficult terrain, but it would allow them to break contact and reach a position where helicopter extraction would be possible. How do you know about these routes? Webb asked, his tone carrying both curiosity and suspicion. I've been studying the terrain in this area extensively. The routes exist, but they're not marked on standard military maps because they require precise navigation through challenging ground. Before Webb could respond, the radio crackled with a transmission that made everyone in the room freeze. It was barely audible through static and interference, but the voice was unmistakably that of Lieutenant Harrison, Alpha Squad leader. Any station, this is Alpha 1. We are pinned down and taking heavy fire. Request immediate assistance. Grid 347829. Multiple casualties, cannot move from current position. Cassie grabbed the microphone before anyone could stop her. Alpha 1, this is Base Phoenix. Roger your transmission. What is your tactical situation? Harrison's voice came back strained and desperate. Phoenix, we're surrounded on 3 sides, enemy positions on the ridgelines north and south, estimated 12 to 15 hostiles with automatic weapons. We have 4 wounded, 2 serious, cannot advance or withdraw without taking additional casualties. The situation was exactly what Cassie had predicted, but being right offered no satisfaction when Marines were dying. She looked at Captain Webb, seeing in his expression the terrible weight of command decisions that had no good options. Alpha 1, what is your ammunition status? Webb asked her, taking the microphone from Cassie. Approximately 60% remaining, Harrison replied, but we're burning through it fast. Need extraction or reinforcement within the hour, or we're going to be in serious trouble. Rodriguez was already coordinating with other units, but the closest reinforcements were 40 minutes away, and helicopter extraction was impossible while the patrol remained under fire in the valley floor. The tactical situation offered no conventional solutions that could reach Alpha Squad before their ammunition ran out. Webb turned back to the map, studying the terrain with the intensity of someone whose decisions would determine whether 30 families received folded flags or live sons and daughters. Evans, these alternative routes you mentioned, how confident are you that they exist? Cassie felt the weight of 30 lives settling on her shoulders. Very confident, sir. I've mapped them extensively and calculated movement times, but they would require precise navigation through difficult terrain, and the patrol would need someone to guide them who knows the routes intimately. How intimately? Well enough to navigate them in darkness or under fire, Cassie replied, the words hanging in the air like a challenge to everything the unit had believed about her capabilities. The radio crackled again with Harrison's voice, more desperate now. Phoenix, we're taking increased fire. Need options immediately. Rodriguez looked at the map, then at Cassie, then at Captain Webb. The silence stretched until Webb made the decision that would change everything. Evans, brief me on these extraction routes, all of them, right now. For the first time in 8 months, Cassie Evans had the undivided attention of her command structure, and 30 Marines' lives depended on her proving that all those dismissed suggestions and ignored expertise had been worth preserving.
Captain Webb's attention lasted exactly 4 minutes before military hierarchy reasserted itself in the most predictable way possible. As Cassie began explaining the alternative routes through the Eastern Ridge system, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez interrupted with the kind of institutional authority that had kept her marginalized for 8 months. Sir, with respect, we need to focus on conventional extraction options, Rodriguez said, moving between Cassie and the map. 3rd Platoon can provide overwatch while Alpha Squad attempts to break contact through their original route. It's dangerous, but it's within established doctrine. Webb nodded, his crisis mindset shifting toward familiar solutions despite their obvious inadequacy. Time frame for 3rd Platoon deployment? 45 minutes to reach overwatch positions, another 15 minutes to establish fields of fire and coordinate with Alpha Squad. Cassie felt the window of opportunity closing as the command structure defaulted to approaches that couldn't possibly work within the time constraints they faced. Sir, that's over an hour total. Lieutenant Harrison said they need options immediately. Evans, return to your communications duties, Rodriguez commanded, his tone carrying the weight of direct order. Maintain contact with Alpha Squad and coordinate with incoming support units. The dismissal was swift and absolute. Once again, Cassie found herself relegated to technical support, while men with less terrain knowledge made tactical decisions that would determine whether 30 Marines survived the next hour. She returned to her radio station, but her mind remained focused on the extraction routes that she knew could save lives if anyone would listen. Webb coordinated with other units while Rodriguez briefed the incoming platoon leaders on conventional support options. Their planning centered on overwhelming firepower and direct assault, approaches that might work against smaller hostile forces, but would likely result in additional casualties when facing prepared positions on commanding terrain. Private Johnson arrived in the communications center with updates from the motor pool, and his reaction to the situation revealed how deeply the exclusion mentality was embedded in the unit's thinking. "Heard Alpha Squad's in trouble," he said to Rodriguez, while ignoring Cassie completely. "Good thing we've got real operators handling the rescue instead of desk jockeys trying to play soldier." The comment was directed at Cassie without being addressed to her. A perfect example of how her colleagues managed to dismiss her expertise while acknowledging her presence. Rodriguez's response reinforced the exclusion with subtle but unmistakable authority. This situation requires experienced field operators making hard decisions under pressure, not communications personnel trying to exceed their assigned roles. Cassie continued monitoring radio traffic from Alpha Squad while listening to planning discussions that ignored the most viable extraction options. Harrison's updates painted an increasingly desperate picture. Ammunition running low, 2 Marines with serious wounds requiring immediate medical attention, and hostile forces maneuvering to complete their encirclement. The conventional solutions being planned couldn't possibly reach Alpha Squad in time, but pointing this out would be interpreted as insubordination rather than tactical analysis. Cassie had learned through bitter experience that persistence was viewed as presumption, and that her expertise would be dismissed regardless of its relevance to the situation. Captain Webb's next decision confirmed her fears about institutional thinking overriding practical solutions. "Rodriguez, coordinate with air support for immediate strike missions against hostile positions. If we can suppress their fire, Alpha Squad might be able to break contact independently." "Sir," Cassie interrupted, unable to remain silent while lives hung in balance, "airstrikes in that terrain will be extremely limited in effectiveness. The ridge lines offer too much natural cover, and the hostile positions are too close to Alpha Squad's location for safe engagement distances." Webb paused, acknowledging her point with reluctant attention. "What's your assessment of air support effectiveness?" "Minimal, sir. The terrain features that make Alpha Squad vulnerable also provide excellent protection for hostile forces. Airstrikes might force them to take cover temporarily, but they won't eliminate the positions or create opportunities for safe withdrawal." Rodriguez stepped forward with the kind of intervention that had defined Cassie's experience in the unit. "Sir, Evans' assessment is based on theoretical map analysis, not operational experience. Air support has proven effective in similar situations." The distinction between theoretical and operational experience missed the crucial point that Cassie's analysis was based on intimate knowledge of the specific terrain rather than general principles. But explaining this would require acknowledging expertise that the command structure wasn't prepared to recognize. Webb made his decision based on conventional wisdom rather than terrain-specific analysis. "Coordinate airstrikes for maximum suppression effect. Alpha Squad will attempt breakout during the bombardment." As planning continued around approaches that Cassie knew couldn't work, she found herself in an impossible position. Her expertise offered solutions that could save 30 Marines, but her role in the unit gave her no authority to implement those solutions. She could only watch while inadequate plans moved forward because they fit within established doctrine and chain of command expectations. The radio brought another transmission from Harrison, his voice tight with stress and fatigue. Phoenix, we're down to approximately 40% ammunition. 2 Marines are unconscious from blood loss. Need immediate extraction or we're going to lose people. The urgency in Harrison's voice made the inadequacy of conventional solutions starkly apparent, but the command structure remained committed to approaches that prioritized institutional authority over tactical effectiveness. Cassie realized that 30 Marines might die because their survival depended on expertise that fell outside established categories of military competence. She returned to her communications duties, maintaining contact with Alpha Squad while monitoring the deployment of resources that couldn't possibly reach them in time. The exclusion was complete and systematic, but it was also creating conditions where her unauthorized action might become the only option that could save lives. For the first time in 8 months, Cassie began seriously considering whether following orders was more important than preventing 30 funerals.
Well, conventional rescue plans moved forward with bureaucratic inevitability. Cassie Evans sat at her communication station with knowledge that felt like a physical weight pressing against her chest. Every radio transmission from Alpha Squad confirmed what her terrain analysis had predicted. They were trapped in a killing zone where conventional extraction methods couldn't possibly succeed within the time constraints they faced. Her personal maps, hidden beneath regulation paperwork, contained solutions that no one else knew existed. 3 months of systematic study had revealed a network of routes through the Eastern Ridge system that could provide concealed movement from Alpha Squad's position to an extraction point beyond the reach of hostile forces. The routes were challenging and required precise navigation, but they offered the only realistic possibility for getting 30 Marines out alive. The irony was crushing. Cassie possessed exactly the knowledge needed to save lives, but 8 months of systematic dismissal had created a situation where sharing that knowledge would be interpreted as insubordination rather than life-saving expertise. She found herself caught between military discipline and moral imperative, knowing that following orders might mean watching 30 men die.
At 14:25 hours, Cassie Evans faced the defining moment of her military career as she sat in the communications center with 30 lives hanging in the balance and institutional authority preventing her from acting on knowledge that could save them. The weight of military discipline pressed against moral imperative, creating internal conflict that threatened to tear her apart. Every military instinct told her to follow orders, maintain her assigned role, and trust that experienced officers would find solutions within established doctrine. 8 months of systematic dismissal had reinforced the message that her expertise was unwelcome outside her designated specialty and that persistence would be interpreted as insubordination rather than dedication. But Lieutenant Harrison's increasingly desperate radio transmissions painted a picture that conventional solutions couldn't address. Phoenix, hostile fire is intensifying. We have 3 Marines unconscious from blood loss. Ammunition down to 30%. Need immediate extraction or we're going to lose people. Captain Webb's response revealed the limitations of institutional thinking when faced with unconventional problems. Alpha 1, air support beginning bombardment in 5 minutes. Prepare for withdrawal on my command. Cassie knew that the airstrike wouldn't create conditions for safe withdrawal. The terrain provided too much natural protection for hostile forces, and Alpha Squad would remain vulnerable during any movement through the valley floor. Her private knowledge offered alternatives, but sharing it would require challenging the entire command structure that had spent months marginalizing her expertise. The internal conflict intensified as she listened to Webb coordinate with air support. His tactical decisions were professionally competent within conventional parameters, but they ignored terrain-specific factors that made success impossible. Cassie possessed exactly the knowledge needed to save lives, but military protocol demanded that she remain silent while inadequate plans moved forward. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez reinforced the institutional barriers with casual dismissal that reflected deeper cultural problems. Evans, monitor emergency frequencies for potential survivor communications. This situation requires operational experience, not theoretical map analysis. The designation of her expertise as theoretical missed the crucial point that her terrain knowledge was more comprehensive than anyone else's in the unit. But correcting this misunderstanding would require explaining preparation that had been dismissed as inappropriate for months. Cassie found herself trapped between military discipline and moral responsibility. Her personal maps contained detailed routes through the Eastern Ridge system that could provide concealed movement to extraction points beyond hostile observation. The routes were challenging and required precise navigation, but they offered realistic possibilities for getting Alpha Squad out alive. More importantly, she knew about local superstitions that kept hostile forces away from specific areas, creating intelligence advantages that no one else possessed. The airstrike began at 14:30 hours with thunderous explosions that echoed through the valley system. For 3 minutes, precision munitions targeted suspected hostile positions on the surrounding ridgelines. The bombardment was professionally executed and tactically sound within conventional parameters, but Cassie knew it wouldn't achieve the suppression necessary for safe withdrawal. Harrison's transmission confirmed her assessment. Phoenix, air support is having minimal effect. Hostile positions are well protected by natural cover. We're still taking effective fire from multiple directions. Webb's response revealed the limitations of institutional thinking. Alpha 1, can you identify specific targets for additional strikes? Negative, Phoenix. Targets are dispersed and concealed. Air support isn't going to solve this problem. The admission that conventional approaches had failed created a moment of silence in the communications center. Cassie felt 30 lives pressing against her conscience while institutional authority prevented her from offering solutions that could save them. The internal conflict reached a breaking point that demanded resolution. She thought about her father's training philosophy. Understand the ground so completely that it becomes an extension of your own mind. He taught her that preparation created opportunities to help others when conventional approaches failed. But he'd also served in a military culture that valued individual initiative within appropriate channels.
The current situation fell outside appropriate channels because the command structure couldn't recognize expertise that exceeded assigned roles. Cassie's knowledge offered hope, but only if she was willing to act without authorization and accept consequences that could end her military career. Harrison's next transmission eliminated any remaining ambiguity about the situation. "Phoenix, we're down to 20% ammunition. Hostile forces are maneuvering for final assault. If we don't get extraction options in the next 10 minutes, we're going to be overrun." 10 minutes. Cassie looked at Captain Webb and Staff Sergeant Rodriguez as they coordinated additional air support that couldn't possibly arrive in time. Their professional competence was unquestionable, but their institutional thinking couldn't adapt to situations requiring unconventional solutions. She made her decision with the clarity that came from understanding that some things mattered more than following orders. 30 Marines were going to die unless someone acted on knowledge that institutional authority refused to acknowledge. Her expertise offered their only realistic chance for survival. Cassie quietly gathered her personal maps and navigation equipment while monitoring continued radio traffic from Alpha Squad. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands remained steady as she prepared to challenge everything her command structure believed about competence, authority, and the proper limits of individual initiative. The consequences would be severe, but 30 families deserved to see their sons and daughters again more than she deserved to protect her military career. Sometimes following conscience required breaking rules that prioritized institutional authority over human life. As she prepared to leave the communications center, Cassie realized that proving her expertise would require more than just offering suggestions that could be dismissed. It would require demonstrating capabilities that no one believed she possessed and accepting responsibility for outcomes that could determine 30 futures. The internal conflict resolved itself into absolute clarity about what mattered most, bringing 30 Marines home alive regardless of what it cost her personally.
At 14:37 hours, Cassie Evans made the decision that would define the rest of her life. While Captain Webb coordinated with air support and Staff Sergeant Rodriguez managed conventional rescue protocols, she quietly slipped out of the communications center with her personal navigation equipment and detailed terrain maps. Her heart pounded with the certainty that she was crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Her plan was simultaneously simple and extraordinarily risky. Alpha Squad was trapped in a killing zone because conventional thinking couldn't conceive of extraction routes that required unconventional navigation. Cassie possessed intimate knowledge of alternative paths through the Eastern Ridge system, but sharing that knowledge through proper channels had proven impossible due to institutional resistance. The only way to save 30 Marines was to guide them personally through routes that existed on her private maps, but nowhere in official military doctrine. This would require unauthorized deployment into hostile territory, direct violation of orders, and acceptance of consequences that could include court-martial and imprisonment. But 30 lives outweighed personal risk, and Cassie had learned that sometimes doing the right thing required breaking rules that prioritized institutional authority over moral responsibility. She moved through the base with purposeful efficiency, gathering specialized equipment from her personal locker while avoiding areas where her absence might be immediately noticed. Her gear selection reflected months of preparation for situations that no one expected her to face: precision compass, emergency medical supplies, climbing equipment, and communication devices calibrated for terrain-specific challenges. The most critical items were her personal maps, annotated with technical information that didn't exist anywhere else. 3 months of systematic study had created navigation aids that could guide Alpha Squad through terrain that hostile forces considered impassable. The routes were challenging and required expert guidance, but they offered realistic possibilities for extraction under conditions where conventional approaches had failed. Cassie's departure from the base perimeter required careful timing and intimate knowledge of security protocols. She'd observed guard rotations during her evening map study sessions, noting patterns that created brief windows for unauthorized movement. Her communications background provided advantages in understanding surveillance equipment limitations and blind spots that could be exploited. The terrain between Base Phoenix and Alpha Squad's position covered 8 kilometers of mountainous ground that most personnel considered impassable without vehicle support. But Cassie had studied every ridge, every valley, and every potential obstacle during her systematic preparation.
She knew routes that could be navigated quickly and quietly, using natural concealment to avoid detection by both base security and hostile forces. Her movement through the initial approach terrain felt like vindication of preparation that had been dismissed as inappropriate enthusiasm. Every landmark matched her mental maps, every distance calculation proved accurate, and every route selection provided the concealment and tactical advantages she'd anticipated. For the first time in 8 months, her expertise was being used for its intended purpose. The radio traffic she monitored through her portable equipment painted an increasingly desperate picture from Alpha Squad's position. Harrison's transmissions revealed that conventional rescue efforts weren't creating opportunities for extraction and that time was running out for Marines who needed immediate medical attention. Phoenix, we're down to 15% ammunition, Harrison reported at 14:45 hours. 2 Marines are critical and need immediate evacuation. Hostile forces are positioning for final assault. Captain Webb's response revealed the exhaustion of institutional options. Alpha 1 maintained position, additional air support requested, but time frame uncertain. Cassie knew that additional air support wouldn't solve the fundamental problem of moving 30 Marines through a killing zone where conventional routes offered no protection. Her unauthorized action represented their only realistic chance for survival, but it also represented the complete breakdown of military discipline and chain of command authority. As she approached the ridge system that would provide access to Alpha Squad's position, she activated her emergency beacon on a frequency that would alert the command structure to her unauthorized deployment. The signal would eventually reveal her location and actions, but it would also provide coordination information that could support her extraction efforts. The climb through the eastern ridges tested every skill she developed through years of preparation that no one else knew about. The terrain was technically challenging, but manageable for someone with her background and equipment. More importantly, it provided concealed approaches to Alpha Squad's position that bypassed all known hostile observation posts. Her personal maps proved their value as she navigated through terrain that didn't exist on official military charts. The route she had identified offered exactly the tactical advantages she'd calculated: concealed movement, protection from observation, and access to extraction points beyond hostile engagement ranges. At 14:52 hours, Cassie reached an observation position that provided direct visual contact with Alpha Squad's location. The tactical situation was exactly as desperate as radio communications had indicated. 30 Marines were pinned down in a natural depression, surrounded by hostile positions on commanding terrain. Their ammunition was nearly exhausted, wounded personnel required immediate medical attention, and conventional extraction routes remained completely untenable. But Cassie's elevated position also revealed something that no one else knew. The eastern ridge routes she'd studied provided clear approaches to Alpha Squad's position that were invisible from hostile observation posts. The Marines could be extracted through terrain that hostile forces couldn't observe or effectively engage. She activated her radio equipment and transmitted on Alpha Squad's tactical frequency. Alpha 1, this is Phoenix Navigation. I have visual contact with your position and extraction routes available through eastern ridges. The response came immediately, filled with confusion and desperate hope. Phoenix Navigation, this is Alpha 1. Identify yourself and your authorization for this net. Cassie took a deep breath and committed fully to unauthorized action that would save lives or destroy her military career. Alpha 1, this is Specialist Evans, with detailed knowledge of extraction routes through eastern terrain. I am in position to guide you to safety, but we need to move immediately. The silence that followed lasted for an eternity, before Harrison's voice returned, tight with the kind of decision-making that combat situations demanded. Evans, what is your tactical assessment? Alpha 1, I have concealed routes mapped that will take you to extraction points beyond hostile observation. Difficult terrain, but manageable with proper guidance. We can get everyone out alive. Harrison's next words changed everything. Phoenix Navigation, we're out of options. Guide us out.
At 14:56 hours, Cassie Evans began the most critical navigation mission of her life as she guided 30 trapped Marines through terrain that everyone else had deemed impossible to navigate under combat conditions. Her unauthorized action had crossed every line of military protocol, but Lieutenant Harrison's desperate acceptance of her guidance meant that lives now depended on expertise that had been dismissed for 8 months. Alpha 1, I need you to move your wounded to the center of your position, Cassie transmitted, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was attempting. We're going to extract through the eastern ridge system using routes that aren't on any official maps. Harrison's response carried the weight of command decisions made under impossible circumstances. Phoenix Navigation, what are our movement requirements?
Cassie consulted her personal maps, annotated with tactical information that existed nowhere else in military doctrine. Alpha 1, the route requires movement through steep terrain for approximately 800 meters, then follows concealed ridge paths to extraction points, challenging but manageable with proper guidance. What followed was a masterclass in navigation expertise applied under the most demanding conditions possible. Cassie's months of systematic preparation had created capabilities that no one in her unit understood or appreciated, but which now represented the difference between 30 Marines coming home alive or dying in an Afghan valley. Her first tactical decision revealed the depth of her terrain knowledge. Instead of guiding Alpha Squad directly toward the eastern ridges, she directed them through a seemingly circuitous route that used natural defilade to protect them from hostile observation. The path existed only on her personal maps because it required understanding how terrain features created dead space, invisible from surrounding high ground. Alpha 1, move bearing 078 degrees for 200 meters until you reach the rock outcropping marked on your maps as Hill 47, she transmitted, watching their movement through her elevated observation position. That will put you in dead ground where hostile forces can't maintain visual contact. Harrison's squad moved with the desperate efficiency of Marines who understood that unconventional situations required unconventional solutions. Their movement through the initial approach terrain validated Cassie's tactical analysis while demonstrating capabilities that exceeded anything her colleagues had ever believed possible. But the real test came when Alpha Squad reached the base of the Eastern Ridge system and encountered terrain that wasn't navigable using standard military procedures. The route Cassie had identified required technical climbing skills and precise route finding through areas where a single navigation error could result in fatal falls or exposure to hostile fire. Phoenix Navigation were looking at near vertical rock faces, Harrison reported. How do we get 30 Marines up this terrain? Cassie's response drew on knowledge that combined her Welsh mountain training with systematic study of local geological conditions. Alpha 1, there's a climbing route that follows natural fault lines in the rock face. I'm going to guide you through it, step by step. What followed challenged every assumption about what communication specialists could accomplish under combat conditions. Cassie's months of systematic preparation had created capabilities that no one in her unit understood or appreciated, but which now represented the difference between 30 Marines coming home alive or dying in an Afghan valley. Her first tactical decision revealed the depth of her terrain knowledge. Instead of guiding Alpha Squad directly toward the eastern ridges, she directed them through a seemingly circuitous route that used natural defilade to protect them from hostile observation. The path existed only on her personal maps because it required understanding how terrain features created dead space invisible from surrounding high ground. Alpha 1, move bearing 078 degrees for 200 meters until you reach the rock outcropping marked on your maps as Hill 47, she transmitted, watching their movement through her elevated observation position. That will put you in dead ground where hostile forces can't maintain visual contact. Harrison's squad moved with the desperate efficiency of Marines who understood that unconventional situations required unconventional solutions. Their movement through the initial approach terrain validated Cassie's tactical analysis while demonstrating capabilities that exceeded anything her colleagues had ever believed possible. But the real test came when Alpha Squad reached the base of the Eastern Ridge system and encountered terrain that wasn't navigable using standard military procedures. The route Cassie had identified required technical climbing skills and precise route finding through areas where a single navigation error could result in fatal falls or exposure to hostile fire. Phoenix Navigation were looking at near vertical rock faces, Harrison reported. How do we get 30 Marines up this terrain? Cassie's response drew on knowledge that combined her Welsh mountain training with systematic study of local geological conditions. Alpha 1, there's a climbing route that follows natural fault lines in the rock face. I'm going to guide you through it, step by step. What followed challenged every assumption about what communication specialists could accomplish under combat conditions. Cassie's months of systematic preparation had created capabilities that no one in her unit understood or appreciated, but which now represented the difference between 30 Marines coming home alive or dying in an Afghan valley. Her first tactical decision revealed the depth of her terrain knowledge. Instead of guiding Alpha Squad directly toward the eastern ridges, she directed them through a seemingly circuitous route that used natural defilade to protect them from hostile observation. The path existed only on her personal maps because it required understanding how terrain features created dead space invisible from surrounding high ground. Alpha 1, move bearing 078 degrees for 200 meters until you reach the rock outcropping marked on your maps as Hill 47, she transmitted, watching their movement through her elevated observation position. That will put you in dead ground where hostile forces can't maintain visual contact. Harrison's squad moved with the desperate efficiency of Marines who understood that unconventional situations required unconventional solutions. Their movement through the initial approach terrain validated Cassie's tactical analysis while demonstrating capabilities that exceeded anything her colleagues had ever believed possible. But the real test came when Alpha Squad reached the base of the Eastern Ridge System and encountered terrain that wasn't navigable using standard military procedures. The route Cassie had identified required technical climbing skills and precise route finding through areas where a single navigation error could result in fatal falls or exposure to hostile fire. Phoenix Navigation were looking at near-vertical rock faces, Harrison reported. How do we get 30 Marines up this terrain? Cassie's response drew on knowledge that combined her Welsh mountain training with systematic study of local geological conditions. Alpha 1, there's a climbing route that follows natural fault lines in the rock face. I'm going to guide you through it step by step. What followed challenged every assumption about what communication specialists could accomplish under combat conditions. Cassie's months of systematic preparation had created capabilities that no one in her unit understood or appreciated, but which now represented the difference between 30 Marines coming home alive or dying in an Afghan valley. Her first tactical decision revealed the depth of her terrain knowledge. Instead of guiding Alpha Squad directly toward the eastern ridges, she directed them through a seemingly circuitous route that used natural defilade to protect them from hostile observation. The path existed only on her personal maps because it required understanding how terrain features created dead space invisible from surrounding high ground. Alpha 1, move bearing 078 degrees for 200 meters until you reach the rock outcropping marked on your maps as Hill 47, she transmitted, watching their movement through her elevated observation position. That will put you in dead ground where hostile forces can't maintain visual contact. Harrison's squad moved with the desperate efficiency of Marines who understood that unconventional situations required unconventional solutions. Their movement through the initial approach terrain validated Cassie's tactical analysis while demonstrating capabilities that exceeded anything her colleagues had ever believed possible. But the real test came when Alpha Squad reached the base of the Eastern Ridge System and encountered terrain that wasn't navigable using standard military procedures. The route Cassie had identified required technical climbing skills and precise route finding through areas where a single navigation error could result in fatal falls or exposure to hostile fire. Phoenix Navigation were looking at near-vertical rock faces, Harrison reported. How do we get 30 Marines up this terrain? Cassie's response drew on knowledge that combined her Welsh mountain training with systematic study of local geological conditions. Alpha 1, there's a climbing route that follows natural fault lines in the rock face. I'm going to guide you through it step by step. What followed challenged every assumption about what communication specialists could accomplish under combat conditions. Cassie's months of systematic preparation had created capabilities that no one in her unit understood or appreciated, but which now represented the difference between 30 Marines coming home alive or dying in an Afghan valley. her first tactical decision.
The helicopter extraction of Alpha Squad at 15:31 hours marked the beginning of Cassie Evans' reckoning with military authority that she had deliberately and systematically violated to save 30 lives. As the rescue aircraft lifted off from the extraction point she had identified through unauthorized terrain analysis, Cassie knew that her next challenge would be facing consequences that could end her military career. Captain Webb's voice crackled through her radio with a mixture of relief and barely controlled fury. "Evans, return to base immediately. You are confined to quarters pending formal investigation of your unauthorized deployment and violation of direct orders." The words carried the weight of institutional authority that Cassie had chosen to challenge when faced with situations where following orders meant watching Marines die. Her response was calm and professional, despite the magnitude of consequences she was about to face. "Roger, Base Phoenix. Phoenix Navigation, returning to base." The hike back to forward operating Base Phoenix provided time for reflection on decisions that had saved 30 lives while potentially destroying her military career. Cassie understood that her unauthorized action represented a fundamental challenge to chain of command authority and military discipline that couldn't be ignored regardless of successful outcomes. But she also understood that 30 families would see their sons and daughters again because someone had finally acted on expertise that institutional thinking couldn't recognize or value. The trade-off seemed reasonable, even if the personal costs proved severe. Her arrival at the base perimeter drew immediate attention from personnel who had monitored the dramatic rescue mission through radio communications. Word had spread quickly that the quiet communications specialist from Wales had somehow guided 30 Marines through terrain that everyone else had deemed impassable under combat conditions. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez met her at the main gate with an expression that mixed professional respect with institutional obligation. "Evans, surrender your weapons and report directly to Captain Webb's office. You're under investigation for violation of orders, unauthorized deployment, and conduct prejudicial to military discipline." The formal charges were exactly what Cassie had expected, but hearing them stated officially marked the transition from emergency action to accountability for consequences. She surrendered her equipment and personal maps to Rodriguez, knowing that the detailed terrain analyses that had saved 30 lives would now become evidence in proceedings that could result in court-martial. The walk to Captain Webb's office felt like a march toward judgment that would determine whether her unauthorized expertise would be recognized as life-saving initiative or punished as dangerous insubordination. Cassie had accepted these risks when she made the decision to act without authorization, but facing them remained daunting. Webb's office had been transformed into an informal tribunal with Colonel Richards from Base Command and Lieutenant Colonel Hayes from the Inspector General's office present to assess the implications of her actions. Their expressions were unreadable as she entered and assumed the position of attention that military protocol demanded. "Specialist Evans," Webb began, his voice carrying the gravity of command decisions that could affect the rest of her life. "You stand accused of deliberately violating direct orders, conducting unauthorized deployment into hostile territory, and engaging in activities that exceeded your assigned role and authority." "Yes, sir," Cassie replied, her voice steady despite the weight of institutional authority arrayed against her. "Do you acknowledge that your actions violated military discipline and chain of command authority?" The question demanded an answer that could either accept responsibility or attempt to justify actions that clearly fell outside military protocol. Cassie chose honesty over self-preservation. "Yes, sir. I deliberately violated orders because 30 Marines were going to die if I didn't act on knowledge that could save them." Colonel Richards leaned forward, his expression revealing curiosity about motivations that had led to such dramatic violation of military protocol. "Evans, explain why you believed you had authority to override command decisions and conduct unauthorized operations." The question struck at the heart of the conflict between institutional authority and moral responsibility that had driven her actions. Her response reflected months of preparation and moments of decision that had prioritized lives over protocols.
Sir, I didn't believe I had authority to override command decisions. I believed I had responsibility to act on knowledge that could save lives when conventional approaches had failed and time was running out. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes consulted files that contained her complete service record and the detailed reports from Alpha Squad's extraction mission. Evans, your unauthorized action succeeded, but it could easily have resulted in additional casualties if your terrain knowledge had been inadequate. How do you justify taking that risk? The question revealed the fundamental challenge of explaining expertise that had been systematically dismissed for 8 months. Cassie's answer drew on preparation that no one else understood and capabilities that institutional thinking couldn't accommodate. Sir, my terrain knowledge wasn't inadequate. I had studied the area extensively, mapped alternate routes, and calculated movement requirements under various conditions. I was confident that my guidance could succeed because I had prepared specifically for situations like this. Webb's next question addressed the broader implications of individual initiative that challenged institutional authority. Evans, if every soldier decided for themselves when to ignore orders based on their personal assessment of situations, military discipline would collapse. How do you reconcile your actions with the need for command authority? The question demanded an answer that could acknowledge the validity of military discipline while defending actions that had violated its fundamental principles. Cassie's answer reflected understanding of institutional requirements balanced against moral imperatives that sometimes transcended regulations. Sir, I understand that military discipline requires following orders even when individuals disagree with command decisions. But I also believe that soldiers have responsibility to act when they possess knowledge that can save lives and conventional approaches had failed. The silence that followed her answer stretched until Colonel Richards spoke with the kind of measured consideration that marked senior leadership decisions. Evans, your actions represent both exceptional competence and serious violation of military protocol. The question we must address is whether your unauthorized expertise justifies your violation of command authority. Cassie understood that her fate now rested on whether institutional thinking could adapt to recognize expertise that fell outside conventional categories. 30 Marines were alive because her knowledge had finally been applied to its intended purpose, but military culture might not be able to acknowledge competence that challenged established hierarchies. Her answer reflected acceptance of consequences balanced against a certainty that she had made the right choice, regardless of personal costs. The admission that she would repeat her violations under similar circumstances revealed the depth of her commitment to principles that transcended institutional authority. It also marked the moment when command decisions would determine whether exceptional competence could be accommodated within military culture that valued discipline above individual initiative.
The silence in Captain Webb's office stretched for what felt like an eternity before Colonel Richards broke it with words that Cassie Evans never expected to hear. His expression had shifted from stern judgment to something approaching admiration as he consulted the detailed after-action reports from Alpha Squad's impossible extraction. "Specialist Evans," Richards began, his tone carrying authority that could reshape her entire military future. "Your unauthorized action violated every principle of military discipline and chain of command. However, your expertise and initiative also saved 30 Marines who would have died if you had followed orders." Cassie remained at attention, uncertain whether his words represented condemnation or recognition. 8 months of systematic dismissal had not prepared her for the possibility that institutional authority might acknowledge competence that exceeded assigned roles. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes leaned forward with files containing testimonials from Alpha Squad members who had experienced her navigation expertise firsthand. "Evans, Lieutenant Harrison's report describes your guidance as extraordinarily precise and tactically superior to any training we received. Staff Sergeant Martinez states that your route knowledge exceeded anything in official doctrine. How do you explain expertise that apparently surpasses standard military training?" The question offered an opportunity to explain preparation that had been dismissed as inappropriate enthusiasm for months. Cassie's answer drew on background and training that her colleagues had never understood or appreciated. "Sir, my expertise comes from intensive training that began in childhood and continued through personal study of local terrain. My father served with 22 SAS Regiment and taught me navigation as a survival skill. I've applied that training to systematic analysis of operational areas that most personnel haven't had opportunity to study." Captain Webb consulted his own files, apparently seeing Cassie's background information for the first time with proper context. "Evans, why wasn't this expertise reflected in your assignment or utilized by unit operations?" The question struck at the heart of institutional thinking that had marginalized her capabilities based on surface-level judgments about what communications specialists should know. Cassie's answer reflected months of frustration with systems that couldn't accommodate competence outside conventional categories. "Sir, my suggestions were consistently dismissed as outside my assigned role. When I offered route analysis or tactical recommendations, I was told to focus on communications duties and leave operational planning to experienced personnel." Colonel Richards exchanged glances with Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, apparently recognizing patterns of institutional thinking that had wasted exceptional capabilities while endangering lives. His next words suggested that Cassie's unauthorized action had revealed broader problems with how military culture identified and utilized expertise. "Evans, your situation represents a significant failure of command assessment and personnel utilization. Extraordinary competence was systematically ignored because it didn't fit conventional expectations about specialist roles." The admission that institutional thinking had failed, rather than individual performance falling short, marked a fundamental shift in how her actions were being evaluated. Instead of facing punishment for violation of protocols, Cassie found herself at the center of discussions about how military culture could better recognize and utilize exceptional capabilities. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes consulted additional files containing recommendations from multiple sources within the military hierarchy. "Evans, based on your demonstrated capabilities and the successful outcome of your unauthorized action, we're prepared to offer you options that better utilize your exceptional expertise." The words carried implications that could transform her military career from marginalized communications specialist to recognized expert whose capabilities would be properly valued and utilized. Cassie remained at attention, uncertain what these options might involve, but amazed that institutional authority was acknowledging competence that had been dismissed for 8 months. "Sir, what options are being considered?" Richard smiled with the satisfaction of command decisions that could transform wasted potential into properly utilized expertise. "Evans, you're being offered immediate transfer to specialized reconnaissance units where your navigation and terrain analysis capabilities will be essential rather than dismissed. Your unauthorized expertise will become your official specialty." The transformation from punishment to recognition exceeded anything Cassie had imagined possible when she made the decision to violate orders and save 30 lives. Her expertise would finally be acknowledged, utilized, and developed within institutional frameworks that could accommodate exceptional competence rather than dismissing it as inappropriate ambition.